Hello, everyone. It's good to see all of you. We go in and make our way into our seats. All I can say at the outset is you are in for a treat. You don't even know. You are in for such a treat tonight. I'm curious, how many of you have seen Doug do this presentation before? All right, several of you haven't. I guarantee you, those who have seen it before, there's a reason they're back to see it again. You're going to so enjoy this. Many of y'all know Doug. Doug Powell is an elder here at Christ Presbyterian Church. He's one of our elders. I've known Doug. Doug, how long have you and I known each other? How long have we been partners in crime? It goes way back.
It's over 20 years now.
Over 20 years. Over 20 years. So I guess we probably met when we were, like 10? So anyway, I'm just going to tell you this. Doug Powell is one of the finest men I've ever known. He's one of the finest men I've ever known in my life. His integrity before the Lord, his scholarship as an apologist, as a scholar of the scripture and biblical archaeology and all those things. He's really a Renaissance man in so many respects. Musically, he has written things. Again, I wish we could just talk all night about all the things that he has done musically. He writes books, incredible. He and I actually have a podcast that we've started, and we're going to get fired back up, called Doctrine Dudes. There's just a lot that I could tell you about Doug. I know he would say, talk about Jennifer, his wife, who is over here with us. But again, the most interesting man in the world is Jesus Christ. And here's Doug to tell you about him.
Well, thank you, and thanks for coming back. If you saw this before, I brought a few extra things with me you didn't see last time, and got a few new slides as well. So what I do have with me, obviously, is a full-size replica of the Shroud of Turin. And you know, the thing is gigantic. It's almost 15 feet long and almost 4 feet wide. And it is a photograph printed on cotton. The real shroud is linen. But other than that, this is as close as you're ever going to get to the Shroud of Turin, because the real one is very rarely on display. And when it is on display, you stand in line forever, and then you get to, you get within 10 or 15 feet for a few seconds, and then they move you off, and it's kind of dimly lit, and so it kind of looks like a big dirty sheet. So, I'm going to give you a chance. About halfway through, I'll take a break, and you come up with to it as close as you want. Take pictures of it. I'll show you a trick to do with your camera. Just don't touch it, and then it'll be up afterwards as well for as long as you want to look at it. So. All right, so a few years ago, I was in Istanbul, and I went to the Topkapi Palace Museum, which is where the Ottoman sultans ruled the empire from for 500 years or so. And I went into the private chambers of the Sultan, and the very first room in there is called the Chamber of Sacred Relics. And they have some biblical artifacts. So I went in there and I saw the cooking pot that Abraham used. I saw Joseph's turban. I saw King David's staff, or Moses' staff, and King David's sword, and I saw some bones from the hand of John the Baptist. Now, I don't think any of those things are authentic, but let's assume they were for a second. What could you possibly do to prove any of these things is authentic? I mean, what could you do to show that stick of wood actually belonged to Moses? And the answer is there's nothing you could do. And this is the position that all relics are in. They cannot be investigated scientifically, with two exceptions, and we're going to talk about both of them tonight, and the main one is the Shroud of Turin. And what makes these two relics exceptions is they can be objects of scientific inquiry. So that is what we're going to start off with, is what you could know about the shroud. So when the shroud first appeared in Europe in 1355, it was presented as the burial shroud of Jesus, and it had this mysterious figure right here, kind of this ghostly figure of a man, and this is so you can see his face, and then the chest, and then the arms, and apparently some blood, and then the front side, and then the back of the man over here, so some blood on the back of the head, and so it's folded over him like this, so the head, top of the head meets in the middle. And this is about all anybody really knew about it. But that's not all that you can see on the shroud. There's obviously all sorts of other stuff going on, so let me kind of walk you through this. The most odd thing are these 8 pairs of triangles, and what these are patches over holes that were made when the shroud was in a fire in 1532 in a church in Chambéry, France. And at this time it had been folded up in and put in a silver chest. And the chest, the church caught on fire, and the chest got so hot that silver started to drip on one corner of the shroud, and it burned all the way through, and because of the way it was folded, it left these 16 different holes, and so the nuns there patched it up, and that's what those things are. Also, the way it was folded left these big scorch marks along the shroud there, and then you can also see that there are water stains. Some of these water stains were made during the fire then, but it's been in at least 3 different fires, and at one time it was rolled up and placed in a jar that leaked, and so it wicked up water on one end of the shroud there. You can also see there's it's a really dirty piece of linen, and you can see there are chunks out of it. Some of these chunks look like they were just worn away, but there are other chunks look like they've been cut out deliberately. So here's a chunk missing up here. Now there's still cloth you can see, because when the nuns put the patches on, they also put a backing cloth, because the linen is pretty threadbare at this point. So they put this backing cloth on, but this rectangle that's missing was cut out over time to give to different dignitaries who would come visit the shroud. So people like Catherine the Great or something like that. They'd cut out little chunks and give it to them. Same thing over here. And then one other interesting feature is this set of 4 holes that makes this L shape like this. And what this is at this time the shroud was folded in a different configuration. It was probably sitting on an altar that had an incense censer above it, and it dropped live embers onto the cloth that burned all the way through in this L-shaped pattern, and left these kind of pattern of 4 holes like that. And those will become more important a little bit later. So this was all that anybody really knew about the shroud for about 400 or 500 years or so. And everything changed when the first photograph was taken of the shroud in 1898. And this is when it became an object of scientific inquiry, but it did so by accident. So what happened was there was an exhibition where the shroud was shown in 1898, and the church decided they wanted some commemorative photos of the shroud. So they hired a photographer to take the very first picture. Now, to understand why this is important, you have to understand how photos used to be made in the dark ages of the 1990s and before you had a camera on your phone, and before there were digital cameras at all. You used to have to put film in the back of a camera. And with the film, it was this light-sensitive celluloid, and whatever you took a picture of that was light turned dark on the film, and whatever was dark turned light on the film. So it was the light and dark reverse of whatever you took a picture of. And then that's what you took into a dark room, and you developed it, and then you passed light through it, and it flipped the light back around onto photographic paper, and that's how you made a picture. But the important thing is that when you take a picture, then what's in the camera on the film is the light and dark reverse of whatever it is you took a picture of. So it's called a negative. So in 1898, they hired a a lawyer in Turin, Italy, to take the first photograph. Now, at this time, photographs were highly technical, so hardly anybody knew how to do it, and they were really expensive, so hardly anybody could afford to do it. But this lawyer was an amateur photographer, and this is the camera he used right here. So this didn't use film, obviously. What it used is glass plates that were about 20 inches or so square, and the light-sensitive chemicals on it weren't super light-sensitive, so it took really long exposures in order to make any sort of image, and this whole camera is about the size of like a hotel fridge. Okay, it's gigantic, and the way you focused it was through that accordion thing. You had to, adjust the front and the back like that. So in 1898, at the end of one of the days in the exhibition, he hauled this thing in there, and in order to make the shroud, it's gigantic. In order to make it fit in the picture, he had to put the camera 25 feet in front of it and on a platform 10 feet tall. And then he took, he couldn't take a picture just like that because there was the cathedral didn't have any electricity. So they had to bring in a generator and some electric lights, and it became one of the first photographs ever taken with electric light. And so when he took the photos, he took two different exposures. One lasted 14 minutes, the other lasted 20 minutes. And then he took the glass plates into the dark room, and when he developed them, what he saw completely astonished him because it was absolutely counterintuitive. The reverse image, the negative image of the shroud, shows a positive image of the man in the picture. And not only that, but there's a ton more detail that you can see. So what that means is when you're looking at this cloth right here, that image of the body has it's a photographic negative, essentially. It has most of the same properties. And so he completely freaked out, and he was a believer, and so he believed he was the first person in almost 2,000 years to see the face of Jesus. And as you can see, it really pops out. There's a lot of detail you can see here. And so this face became a very, very famous image. But because you can see so much detail in the photograph when it's in reverse, which is the positive image of the man, this is what allowed scientists and medical professionals to study the photographs, and it turned this whole thing into an object of scientific inquiry. And it turns out that what you can see in the photographic negative is that the man on the shroud has been brutalized and tortured in all the same ways that we read about Jesus being brutalized and tortured in the Gospels. So here's what they found. On the back of the head, you can see that up here you have these white squiggles. So these are rivulets of blood. Only the body is in reverse. So the blood, which when you come up, you'll see it's dense and dark. So in the photograph, it looks light, almost white. So you see these rivulets of blood all over the back of the head and going around the front of the head as well that are from apparently superficial wounds, which would correspond with what you would expect to see left by a crown of thorns if the crown of thorns was shaped like a helmet, not like a wreath. So I have a replica of what the crown of thorns may have looked like over here that you can see. And there's over 50 different wounds that create those rivulets of blood. There is, you can see a ponytail coming down, or at least long hair. So either the man in the shroud had a ponytail, which was a Jewish hairstyle for men at the time, or it becomes a de facto ponytail because of a blood clot in it, which I will explain later. There are abrasions on the shoulders, and this is consistent with a crucifixion victim carrying the crossbeam or patibulum to the place of crucifixion. And the victims would most often be forced to carry this crossbeam. They wouldn't carry the entire cross because that would weigh about 300 pounds. The crossbeam itself would weigh between 75 and 125 pounds. Then you can see all these hash marks all over the back that are actually, if you look up close, little barbell shapes, and they go all over the front of the body as well. So there's over 200 of them on the back and over 150 of them on the front, and this is what would be left by a Roman scourge. Now, a Roman scourge had two different ways that it could appear. They would both have wooden handles about 18 inches long, and then have these leather thongs coming off the end of it. And then at the end of the thongs, one of the things that could happen is you could have sharp things like pieces of glass or rocks or metal at the end of it. That's what you see in Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ. So that would embed in the flesh, and then the flesh would be stripped away, and it would be, people died during scourgings. But another way a scourging could appear is, instead of the sharp stuff, there could be sheep bones or little lead weights at the end, and they would be in pairs, or there could be 3 of them at the end, and they would leave these deep contusions that would eventually, when there's enough scourge marks, start to break through the skin. And that's what you see here. That's why they have these little barbell shapes, and I have a replica of the scourge over here that you can see as well. The rear end of the man in the shroud is not, it's not flattened out under the weight of the body, which indicates that the man in the shroud is in rigor mortis. So he's been dead between 2 and 48 hours, just depending on environmental factors. And then if we go around to the front, you can see that there is an apparent blood wound between the 5th and 6th rib here. And if you look really close, when you come up and check out the shroud, this mark right at the top is about 4 centimeters long, which is the width and shape of a Roman spear tip. And I have a replica over here as well that you can see. See how the blood just kind of drips down, and then it drips onto the small of the back here. It doesn't spew out, which indicates that the heart is not pumping, so it's another indication that the man in the shroud is dead. Right here on the wrist, there is a blood wound that is in the location where a crucifixion nail would go through the wrist, the top of the wrist or the bottom of the palm. And that's the only place that could sustain the body weight. And so that's consistent with crucifixion. Also, you can't see a thumb in the man in the shroud, and that's because the nerve damage would probably make the thumb turn in like that. You can see that there's apparent blood dripping down to the outside of the elbow, which means the arms were in about this position, which obviously is consistent with the position of somebody being crucified. Interestingly, look at the arms. They're unusually long given the anatomically correct rest of the body. And there are a couple of different explanations for that, and both might be true at the same time. One is that the man in the shroud is in rigor mortis, and his position is that he is rocked forward a little bit and his knees are bent. So his arms become long. And the other thing is that there's indications that his shoulders are dislocated. Now, when a crucifixion victim gets put onto the cross, he's nailed onto the crossbeam on the ground. And usually, because if it's a place of crucifixion, the vertical post is already there. So they put the person on the ground, and they nail the wrist to the patibulum, and then when they raise it, it slots onto the vertical post, but it drops right onto it, and it'll pop the shoulders out. If the shoulders don't pop out, you still end up with the same problem, because what happens is immediately the body is in a position that physiologically is reversed in terms of breathing. So the person is in a position where they cannot exhale because of the weight being pressed down on their lungs, and they're just in the wrong position. So the instinct is to pull up, but they can't pull up because their shoulders are popped out of location. And if they are not popped out, then you can only do that a few times before you just run out of gas. So the two positions of the arms, because you've got to somehow get yourself up so you can exhale, and then come back down again. And so the feet would be nailed to the vertical beam, and so you see the wounds right here and right here, and you can see that back on the wrist wound, see how it's bifurcated. It goes in two different directions. Those are the two different positions of the arms. Okay? So you can see there's a lot here that corresponds exactly with what we read about in the Gospels. So the question is, what are the odds that this could be anybody other than Jesus? And this has been calculated a couple of different times. One is by a pair of authors named Kenneth Stevenson and Gary Habermas. Kenneth Stevenson was the communications director for a group of scientists called the Shroud of Turin Research Project, which we'll talk a lot about in a minute. And his co-author on two different books was Gary Habermas, who is a philosopher and an apologist, and one of my professors on the resurrection. And so this is where I was introduced to a lot of this credible evidence is from him. And so what they did is they took 7 different features on the shroud, and they assigned them conservative probabilities, and then calculated the odds that it could be anybody other than Jesus. So they looked at the crown of thorns. They give that a 1 in 400. There is nobody in history before Jesus that was crucified with a crown of thorns, and it was done to mock him for being a king. Okay, this isn't something they did for people accused of insurrection, and there are a lot of people who were crucified for insurrection. But the crown of thorns is unique to Jesus' crucifixion. So they give that a 1 in 400. No decomposition, they give 1 in 10. That's pointing at the nose and mouth because they're looking for evidence of putrefaction or liquefaction in the mucous membrane, and there's no evidence of that on the shroud. They give spear wound 1 in 27. The way they come up with that number is in the Gospels. You read that Jesus was crucified between 2 other people, and when the soldier is checking to see if they are still alive, they kind of had 3 choices. So one is to just be convinced that they're dead and do nothing, times 3, or take a sword and poke at them, and times 3, or take a spear and poke them, times 3. So 3 times 3 times 3 is 27. Crucified without ropes, they give that a 1 in 2. The idea here is that there's so much pressure on the nails when somebody's crucified that very often the wrist would pop off the nail heads and the victim would flop forward. So there were ropes that would fortify the arms to the crossbeam. Sometimes ropes weren't even used at all. And so there's no evidence that there's ropes on the man in the shroud, and we don't see any record of that in the Gospels. Scourge marks, they give 1 in 2. When somebody was condemned to crucifixion, they were almost always scourged beforehand because the idea was to weaken the body. And so somebody who is scourged first is suffering from blood loss and dehydration. There's all sorts of physiological trauma they're suffering that would weaken them so much that they wouldn't last nearly as long on the cross as if they were just put up there without being scourged first. Because if you were in good shape and you were well nourished and you were well hydrated and you were not scourged and you were crucified, you could last upwards of a week. So most everybody got scourged first. Now, in Jesus' case, he's scourged in order to avoid being crucified, but he ends up being crucified anyway. So they give that a 1 in 2. And then you see no broken legs. They give that a 1 in 3. Okay, again, Jesus is crucified between 2 other people, and they both have their legs broken, so that's 1 in 3. And then linen shroud, buried in a linen shroud, is the most conservative estimate they have, which is 1 in 8. And the idea here is the reason why this is so conservative is because it was just so rare for the body to be given back, or unusual. So in the 1,000-year period when crucifixion was practiced, there's been an estimated 2 billion people that lived during that time. So you got to figure half of them are men, and the estimate is that the odds are about 1 in 100 that a man would be crucified. Now, in all the archaeological evidence that we have, there have only been 4 crucifixion victims that have ever been found. Only 2 are from the 1st century, and only 1 of them is from the area around Jerusalem. And I have a replica of the heel bone with the nail still going through it over here that you can see. So it was very rare. Now, the Jews also practiced double burial. So when you read about the burial of Jesus, they were going to come back a year later and gather his bones and put it in a bone box, because that's what they did at the time. Okay, so the longest the body would have been in a burial shroud would have been about a year or so, and yet we just don't have anybody else. That we don't have any evidence for it. So a lot of the times, if it was a time of insurrection, the Romans wouldn't give the body back at all. They just leave the body on the cross and let it rot as a warning of what would happen to you if you challenged Rome. And sometimes they wouldn't give the body back, and they'd put it in a shallow common grave and just kind of erase you. So there are all sorts of reasons why we don't have a lot of crucifixion victims, but they assign this 1 in 8 as a result. So if you multiply that all together, it's 1 in 83 million, almost 83 million, that it could be anybody other than Jesus. There's a mathematical physicist who is another professor of mine who calculates it this way. He says crown of thorns 1 in 5,000, no decomposition 1 in 500. He gives carried the cross 1 in 2. Sometimes the victims wouldn't be in good enough shape to carry the cross. The spear wound he gives 1 in 10. Hasty burial, this is a different category here. So the idea here is that the body needs to be washed. It's not fully prepared for burial, and this is probably why the women are at the tomb early on Sunday morning, and how they discover it empty. They've come back to complete the burial. So they give that a 1 in 20. Crucified with nails, same thing as crucified without ropes. And then they'll bury it in a linen shroud. He gives 1 in 100. If you use those numbers, then you end up with 1 in 200 billion. It could be anybody other than Jesus. Okay, let's say he's off by a factor of 100. You're still at like 1 in 2 billion. It's a statistical lock if those numbers are legitimate. So as more photographs were taken, there was another official one in the 1930s and another one in the 50s or 60s. These photos kept getting higher resolution, and there was more and more for scientists to study. And in the 1970s, the mid-70s, this all came to a head with a group of researchers called the Shroud of Turin Research Project. And this was a group of 33 American scientists who came up with a list of, they had a couple dozen tests that they wanted to run on the shroud, and they got permission to do it. So the shroud was on display in October of 1978, and so when the shroud was at the end of the exhibition, they were given access to it. Now, there are shroud skeptics who say that this group of scientists were just a bunch of Christians who committed confirmation bias because they believed that the shroud was authentic, and so they just went over there and they did a bunch of tests that proved what they already believed. But this is a mischaracterization of the STURP team, because out of the 33 American scientists, although the majority of them self-identify as Christians, not all of the Christians believed that the shroud was authentic. And you had, and they were all sorts of kinds of Christians anyway. You had Roman Catholics, you had mainstream evangelicals, you had mainstream Protestants, you had evangelicals, but there were also Jews on the team, and there were atheists on the team. So not everybody believed that that the shroud was authentic, including the Christians. But the thing that united them, what makes them important, is that they all had PhDs or the equivalent terminal degree in their area of expertise, and they all worked for highly credible institutions like Los Alamos National Labs, the Sandia National Labs, the Air Force Weapons Lab, Air Force Academy, Caltech, JPL. So these were real scientists who went over to do real scientific experiments. And so they were allowed 120 hours access to the shroud on a running clock. So as soon as it started, the clock was ticking and they had to get all of their tests done. So they actually got together and practiced doing this so they could get everything done. And so they did a number of different tests. They used direct microscopy and infrared spectrometry, some X-ray fluorescence spectrometry, X-ray radiography, thermography, ultraviolet fluorescence spectrometry, and then several different kinds of scientific photography. And so this is what it looked like when they got access to the Shroud, and they're in a room in the palace that's adjacent to the cathedral there in Turin, Italy. And this table they had specially built here, and it has these panels that could be removed. So the Shroud is mounted magnetically on it, and they could remove different panels in the back so they could do x-rays or backlighting or things like that. This is the backing cloth being removed for the first time in 400 years. They weren't allowed to remove it all the way. They were allowed to open it up, and I'll explain why in a minute. The guy in the white is the leader of the Italian scientific team, Giovanni Rigi. So out of the 120 hours, the first 12 was actually given to the Italian team of scientists because it was the host country. So they had the first shot at it, and the rest went to the American STURP team. So the guy in the gray jacket is Raymond Rogers. He's a chemist from Los Alamos. We'll talk more about him in a minute. And the guy in between them is John Jackson. He is a physicist from the Air Force Academy, and we'll talk more about him in a minute. So what they're doing here in this test, they weren't just like, opening up the cloth to that extent. The question is, what's on the backside of the Shroud? Because nobody knows. It's got this backing cloth on it. So, but they weren't allowed to take the whole thing off. So what Rigi did was he had this device that created this gap that allowed them to feed some fiber optic cable into the cloth so they could see. And what it looked like is pretty interesting, because the backside of the Shroud only has an image where it shows the front side of the man. So on the back side of the cloth right here, it shows a very faint image on the other side. On the back side that shows the back side of the man, there's no image at all. And this got confirmed in 2002 when there was a restoration done on the Shroud, and they totally removed the backing cloth and replaced it with a different one. And that's when they confirmed that the front side of the body is very, very faintly visible on the backside, which becomes important here in a minute. Now the Shroud is so big, as you can see, that when it was possible to do more than one test or measurement at a time, they would do so. So that's what's going on here. This is some of the X-ray photography being done. I don't know if we can see it here. It's kind of hard to see, but there's a parquet floor in the palace there. And this became a problem because these X-ray photos would take 20 minutes a pop, and they've got to do 42 of them to cover the whole Shroud. And every time a truck drove past the palace, it would rock the parquet floor and blur the photo. So they had to do all their work at like 2 or 3 in the morning. All week long. Okay, so the left photo there is a close-up of one of the eyes, and the right photo is a close-up of the tip of the nose. So you can see there's hardly any change to the cloth that creates the image. So the question is that the STURP team was trying to answer is what made the image? So at the end of their access to the Shroud, they took all their tests and measurements back to America, and it took 3 years to publish their findings in over 20 different peer-reviewed scientific journals. So they didn't go into like Christianity Today or any kind of pop media at all. They were scientists who were doing scientific work for other scientists to engage with. So what they were able to answer in regards to the question of what created the image, the answer is We don't know. They don't have any idea. It was an ongoing mystery. But they definitively answered what didn't make the image. And what did not make the image is that it's not made by paint, stain, dye, ink, pigment, oils, any kind of biological chemicals, and no artistic method. They know that for sure. And there's a couple different ways they knew this. Number one is if you took a body and you put some kind of ink or paint on it and you put a sheet on top of it and it conforms to the body, then it would look exactly, it would transfer to the sheet. It would look exactly like the body as long as the sheet was in the same contours as the body. But as soon as you lift it and flatten it out, it would be distorted. And the image of the man in the shroud is not distorted, so it's not made by contact. But more importantly, you can see how how faint the change in the linen is where the image is. Okay, the image is so faint on the cloth. It turns out that when you're looking at the threads here, each linen thread isn't just one thing. It's like 200 different fibrils, microfibrils, coiled together, and the image is a change in the chemical composition that's only on the outermost fibrils, and it doesn't penetrate any deeper than that. And what that means is, okay, human hair is 60 microns in diameter. A micron is 1/1000th of a millimeter. One of these linen fibrils is 1/4 that diameter. It's only 15 microns, and the image penetrates only 0.2 microns deep into the thread. Okay, I've actually made a mark that you can't even see. It's so faint, I can barely see it up there. It looks like a pixel that's out, but it's not. That's how small it is relatively. That's how far it penetrates into the cloth. And this is important because any kind of paint, stain, dye, chemical, any kind of biological method of creating an image on the cloth is going to be absorbed into the cloth. And it's not there. There isn't any. There is no pigment in there. There's nothing absorbed into the cloth. And now think about the double image on the front side of the body. You've got an image on both sides of the cloth and no image, no change in between. It's not absorbed all the way through. We don't know how this happens. Okay? Another interesting thing about the image is that it has three-dimensional information in it. And what that means is that the density of the image, where it's darker and more in focus, indicates the distance the cloth was from the body that's depicted in it. So as the cloth is laying on the body, the cloth doesn't wrap the body like, a wetsuit or something like that. There's gaps in it. And anywhere the cloth was within 4 centimeters of the body, it registers on the cloth. Outside of that, there's no image of the body. But within that 4 centimeters, the closer it is to the body, the denser it is on the cloth, and the more defined it is. And if you take that information and you put it into a computer modeler like a VP8 image analyzer, which is what they had in the 1970s, which was super cutting edge technology, then you create a 3-dimensional image. Okay? This is not possible with a photograph or a painting. This is the only image that has ever done that. We don't know how this happens. Okay? So the other thing is, the stuff that looks like blood on the shroud turns out to be human blood on the shroud, and it's type AB, which is the rarest blood type, which is 3 times more common in Middle Eastern Jews than it is in Europeans. Not only that, but it is post-mortem blood. They know this because of the ultraviolet photographs show a halo of serum that's separated from the red blood cells. So the man in the shroud is dead. Also, the blood coming out of the side wound is a combination of pulmonary edema, 6 parts pulmonary edema and 1 part blood, which is an indication that the man asphyxiated. That's what gets created in the lungs when somebody asphyxiates. So There are skeptics of the shroud who say, but they found trace elements of paint on the blood, so we know it got painted on there. And it is true that there were trace elements of paint found on the blood on the shroud. But what the skeptics do not tell you is that this trace element, it's iron oxide, which is an ingredient in medieval paint. So it's like that and egg white and stuff like that got mixed together to make paint. So this iron oxide, this trace element they're talking about, is not only on the blood, but it's also on the parts of the cloth that have an image and where there's no image. And there's so little of it that if you collected all of it, you could maybe recreate about one blood drop. Okay, it's very, very little, and it doesn't make the image itself. Not only that, but the image turns out not to go underneath the blood. Okay, the image doesn't go under the blood. The blood gets on the cloth before the image does. So if you were going to fake it, if you were going to paint this thing, you'd probably paint the body first and then paint the blood onto the right spots of the body. But the way this works is you'd have to paint the blood first and then paint the body around the blood. Okay, of course, nobody's going to do that. But the better explanation for the iron oxide on the cloth is that there were over 120 different copies of the shroud that have been made that were then laid on top of it in order to kind of sanctify or bless them, and that's probably a contamination from doing that. Okay? So this is Barry Schwartz. He is one of the 2 photographers on the STURP team, and that is him with the camera that took the very first photograph. And Barry is who I got the shroud from. My replica from. So this is his photograph. He took this photo, and he became a friend, and then he eventually became one of my professors as well. And so Barry is he's a lifelong Orthodox Jew. Well, he's not lifelong. He was raised as an Orthodox Jew, and he left the faith. So he was not practicing as an adult. He was an atheist for all of his adult life. His mom and dad were lifelong practicing Orthodox Jews, but Barry didn't believe in the shroud. He'd never been out of the U.S. He thought he was just going to get a free trip to Italy, and so he thought this was a great experience. So but he ended up. It was such a profound thing for him, he gave talks on the shroud. And about 10 or 15 years after the STURP team, he was given a talk in his hometown in New York, and somebody raised their hand and said, "Do you think it's Jesus?" And he said, "I don't know. I don't really have a firm opinion." And his mom was in the audience, and they got in the car to go home, and his mom, the lifelong Orthodox Jew, said, "Barry, of course it's authentic. Of course it's Jesus." And he said, "Why would you think that?" And she said, "Because they kept it." And what she was getting at is pretty interesting. She, she realized that, think about who discovered the shroud. It was Peter and John. They were deeply committed, practicing Jews. They were trying to live according to the Jewish laws they understand it. And at that time, the shroud would have violated 2 different laws. One is the second commandment, not to make a graven image, because in the Second Temple period, the Jews didn't allow any image of any people at all. Because if you were going to make an image of God, if you were going to take only the data that you have from the Hebrew Bible and try to draw God, because of all the anthropomorphic language in it, because of all the ways that he's described, you're just going to end up drawing a person. So the way to avoid drawing any image of God is to avoid images of people altogether. So the shroud violates that. Also, because Leviticus 17:11 says that the life is in the blood of a living creature. And so they believed the soul was in the blood. And if a Jew died a violent death and their blood got on their clothes and stuff, they would have to bury the blood with the body, because that's where the soul is. You don't want to separate the blood from the body. And Orthodox Jews to this day still practice that. And so by keeping the shroud, it violates the second commandment because it's got an image of a body on it, and they're separating the blood from the body because they're taking the burial shroud out. Unless the image is not made by human hands, That would not violate the second commandment. And you can't separate the blood from the body if there is no body, right? That's pretty good for Barry's mom. So, okay, so this STURP team was such a successful project that another round of tests was proposed, about 36 tests or so, and one of them was to do radiocarbon dating. This seemed like such an important thing that it got separated out on its own. And by the time that they were trying to figure out how to go about it, the STURP team, for various different reasons, had broken up. But some of the STURP scientists were still in the mix, so you had a couple STURP guys on the radiocarbon team meet with the scientific advisor to the Vatican and also the Archbishop of Turin. The Archbishop of Turin is the custodian of the shroud. Whatever he says goes, unless the Pope says something else. Otherwise, it's going to be all controlled by the Archbishop. So they got together and they decided that the way they were going to do this is they were going to take 7 different samples from at least 3 different areas on the shroud, give the samples to 7 different labs who used one of 2 different forms of radiocarbon dating. But right before they actually cut the sample, the word got out that the Archbishop was not going to adhere to the protocol. And so the scientists started writing to the Archbishop saying, hey, if you change this at all, if you do fewer samples or do it, in fewer labs or only one technique, then it's going to be a hit to the integrity of this, and it's not even going to be worth doing. And yet when the time came, he changed everything. So he, instead of 7 different samples, he allowed 1 sample to be cut, which he divided into 3. So he gave it to 3 labs instead of 7, and they all used the same technique instead of the 2 different techniques. So he changed everything. He never explained himself. He doesn't have to explain himself. But the most important thing that he changed is where they took the sample from, because one of the things that the protocol said was there are certain parts of the shroud that have a high likelihood of contamination and you need to stay away from it. And the place that they said had a high likelihood of contamination was this corner up in the top left. My pin's not showing up. It's the top left corner right up there. So remember, this is the 1978 photograph. So this is, you're actually looking at the picture of what got cut and dated. So this is it right here. And my pen has stopped working, unfortunately. So that little white fin shape is a piece of the shroud that was cut out in 1973, and directly to the right of that is the area that was cut. Okay, so this is them actually doing the cut right here. Now, when they cut the sample, it's about a pinky length of material that they cut. Half of it was put in reserve and saved by Giovanni Rigi, the Italian scientist that I showed you earlier. So he puts half of it in a safe. The other half gets divided into 3 equal weights and given to the 3 different labs. And then 6 months later, the radiocarbon date comes back as being between 1260 and 1380, which gets reported in the media as the shroud is a medieval fake. So at this point, the church decides they're not going to allow any access to scientific investigation anymore on the shroud, and they focus mainly on conservation and preservation, and that's the way it's been ever since. A lot of the scientists immediately kind of just abandoned the work of looking into the shroud because it's it tested to be inauthentic. Now, all of the STURP team findings they all indicated authenticity of the shroud. There's only one outlier test that contradicts that, and this is it. But it was given an unequal amount of weight, for sure. It outweighs all the others in most people's minds. But so there were some scientists who still wanted to do work on the shroud, and because of all the stuff that got collected in 1978, there was enough material to keep going, and other ways that could be investigated. So in 2000, there was a couple of researchers, they were actually a married couple, that had a photograph of one of the radiocarbon samples, the pieces of material that was actually dated, and they took the material, they took the photo of it, and they showed it to 3 different textile experts, and they didn't know what they were looking at, and none of them knew that there were other experts being consulted, and they all said, this is a cloth that has been manipulated. It's been patched using a technique called an invisible reweave, and it looks like it's cotton mixed into linen. And so they came up with this theory that the nuns at the time of the fire, when they put the patches in the backing cloth, they also repaired the cloth along this particular spot, and using this technique of the invisible reweave. And so the chemist from Los Alamos, Raymond Rogers, he thought this was a crazy idea, and he was going to prove it wrong. And he had a piece of the shroud that he had from the 1978 test that he had taken from the inner body of the shroud. Oh, let's see if this pen works. All right. No dice. Okay, we'll just do a whole reboot later. But thanks for the pin, man. So he had a piece of cloth or a thread from the main body of the shroud. Remember, the main body of the shroud is linen. The shroud is linen. It's not just the main body. The shroud is linen. So he had a thread from the inner part of the cloth, and he also had a thread. See that little white area again that says 1973 sample area? He had a thread from there. And so he compared them, and the thread from the main body of the cloth was pure linen. Okay, it was just a nice piece of linen. Then he looked at the thread from the 1973 sample, and it was linen mixed with cotton that had been coated in plant gum to look like the linen and then woven almost invisibly into each other. So he thought, well, then what got tested? Because what got tested is directly adjacent to this 1973 area. So he contacted Giovanni Rigi in Italy, and he got some of the reserve sample that had been taken, and he tested it, and it turns out it's linen with cotton mixed into it, and the cotton's been coated in plant gum to make it look like the linen. And so it's exactly what was proposed in this paper. So he published his findings in a scientific journal for chemists, which is why nobody has ever heard of this, okay? And so it doesn't mean that the radiocarbon dating is wrong, but what it means is it's not representative of the shroud, and so we can just throw that date out. Okay, because we don't know what date the actual pure linen of the shroud is. As a result of this radiocarbon dating, it's never been done. So sometimes you'll hear people kind of attack the integrity of the scientists who did the test, or say that because of the fires it's been in, it changes how it's going to skew the results somehow. And you don't have to go there at all. All you do, with Raymond Rogers is it's an inconclusive date, regardless of whether the other things are true or not. So he proved his point another way in a different paper. In the top right, you'll see a picture of the shroud being backlit, and on the right side of that, you'll see the lighter band. Well, that's just pure linen, and just to the left of it, it turns dark. There's like a darker stripe. Well, some other material has been introduced into the cloth at that point. You can see it photographically, and you can see kind of the reverse of that in the X-ray, where you've got the dark band is the linen, and the lighter gray is where material has been introduced. Okay? So we don't know how old the shroud is. In 2022, There was a new technique called Wax S that was done on the shroud. This kind of became popular last summer. So Wax S is a wide-angle X-ray scattering. This is a technique that's well known, but it's never been used to date textiles. And so some researchers used it to try to date the shroud. So the idea here is with the Wax S, what happens is you're able to put a numeric value to the degradation of the cellulose in the linen, but it doesn't tell you how old it is. It just tells you how degraded it is. So what you have to do is have a known sample, a sample of a known age that you do the same test to and you can compare it to. So they did a test with cloth from the linen cloth from the 2000s, linen cloth from the Middle Ages, linen cloth from the 1st century found at Masada, dated between 55 and 74 AD, and then a 3000 BC Egyptian burial cloth. And when you compare the results, the shroud matches the result from Masada almost exactly. So it indicates that it's 1st century. But even those shroud scholars who think the shroud is authentic recognize there's a massive problem with this technique, which is that it assumes that all the cloths were maintained in consistent conditions throughout their lifetime. And they just weren't. And it shows this kind of test has great variety that results when the shroud is in all sorts of different conditions. So if you're in controlled conditions, this might be worth something, and it might be, it might become more refined later on. But for now, you don't have to put a whole lot of weight in this either. We don't know how old the shroud is. Okay, there's no real hard evidence for it. So. One more thing, and then we'll do a quick break. And this is to answer the question of what made the image. Okay, the STURP team discovered there are 17 different features on the shroud that are that you need to account for with any sort of hypothesis for how the image was formed. Whether you're going to say, the shroud was, you took a bas relief and you heated it up and you put the cloth on it and it kind of burned into it, or you painted it, or whatever. Whatever technique you propose, whether it's artistic or natural, it has to account for all of these 17 features, and none of them can do it. Because you can make something that looks identical to the shroud, but doesn't have all these properties. Because this replica is identical to the shroud, and yet it doesn't have all the properties. Because remember, the emulsion that puts the picture on the cotton that I have here goes deeper than 0.2 microns into the thread. Okay, for example, that's just one example. So the STURP team leader, John Jackson, the physicist, tried to answer the question, just what would it take physically in order to put the image on the cloth the way that we see it, and what would it take chemically? And so this is about the best explanation we got. It's the only one that covers all 17 features of the shroud. And it's called the fall-through radiation hypothesis. So what he came up with was this. So here's the body. It's in rigor mortis. This is how it's wrapped in the shroud. And he says that in order to put the image on the cloth in the way that we see it, that radiation is going to emit from the body at the vacuum ultraviolet range as it dematerializes, which lets the cloth fall all the way through it. Okay? That radiation emits from the body at the vacuum ultraviolet range as the body dematerializes, which lets the cloth fall all the way through it. That's not something you could observe, you can't test for, you can't replicate. Okay, you might be able to come up with a computer lab, computer model for it, but that's about it. Okay, the closest we have to any kind of confirmation is that there has been a physicist who used a laser at the vacuum ultraviolet range who was able to leave a superficial mark that was that deep, that 0.2 microns on linen thread, but that's it. That's all we got. Okay? All right, so I'm going to take maybe no more than a 10-minute break. I want to give you some time, because that was a massive data dump, for you to have some time to get up close to the shroud now that you know kind of what you're looking at. I put some instructions on the screen for you to take your phone and flip the colors, invert them, so that you can then open your camera and come all the way up to the cloth and do your own investigation. It's pretty fascinating what you can see when you invert the colors on your phone. Okay? 10 minutes now.
My pen is charged.
Yeah, my pen is charged too. That's the thing. What's that?
Jeff, we're going to let you do your phone stuff.
Yeah, I guess it is. Yeah. No, my Apple pen is charged. I just confirmed. Yeah. Okay. Good idea. All righty. Well, let's just see if I got it now. Yeah. So if you took a photograph with your camera inverted, unfortunately, it's just the screen that inverts the color. Your photograph is going to go back as well. So you'll have to find some other app or program to flip the photo around. But still, it's pretty cool. What's that? A screenshot while it's inverted does not work either. But if you took a photo of somebody taking a photo, yes, Vin. Screen recording? I don't know. Did you try it? Did it work? It did work. Screen recorded. Bose worked. Okay. Do you have an iPhone? Yeah. Do you have an iPhone? All right. Well, Bose works. So if you want to know how to do it, come talk to Bo down in the second row here. Okay. And we've got the pin working again. All right. So I dumped a ton of scientific evidence on you. Probably more than you thought there was going to be for the shroud, but there's far more than that. But I did stick to the most credible evidence, and enough to make it a compelling case that there's good reason to believe that the shroud existed prior to the radiocarbon date of 1260. So the question is, if the shroud existed before then, where was it? So there actually happens to be a lot of documentary evidence for the shroud. And so I'm going to walk you through it. Now, as I do it, there are a number of different traditions that are a part of this story. I'm going to tell you kind of the general arc of the story, and then I'll pause at certain points and tell you the different variations of how we get there, okay? So it starts with the church, the bishop of Caesarea, Eusebius, who was church father in the 4th century. He was at the Council of Nicaea. He was Constantine's biographer. But most importantly, he wrote an early church history in about 324, which is where we get a lot of information for like where the 27 books of the Bible came from or what happened to the apostles and things like that. And one of the stories he tells is about this guy, the king of Edessa, whose name is Abgar, King Abgar of Edessa. Edessa is a city in southern Turkey right along the Syrian border, and these days it's called Urfa or Sanli Urfa. And so Eusebius says that Abgar suffered from really bad leprosy and arthritis, and so he sent a messenger to go find Jesus because he'd heard about his wonder working, his healing ministry. And so the messenger found Jesus, and he tried to get him to come to Edessa to heal Abgar, and Jesus said that he couldn't come. And according to Eusebius, Jesus wrote a letter and said that he would send someone in the near future. Shortly after that, Jesus was crucified, and after the ascension, the apostle Thomas took the burial shroud and gave it to a disciple named Thaddeus. He's one of the 70 that Jesus sent out according to tradition in Luke 10:1. And so Thaddeus, or Addai, A-D-D-A-I, then goes to Edessa, and he takes the burial shroud and he lifts it up and he puts it on top of Abgar like he's wearing it, and Abgar was healed. And so Abgar became a Christian, and he took the shroud and he folded it up and probably put it in a box, probably with the window cut out so that all you could see of it was the face, and he put it in a niche above the city gate of Edessa. And this is where a pagan idol had stood, and so visitors to this town were supposed to pay tribute to the pagan idol when they went into the city. And so they put the image up there instead. And then when Abgar died, his son became king, and he was a Christian, so he left it there. And then when he died, his son or his little brother who became king reverted to paganism. And so the bishop at that time thought the image would be destroyed, and so he had the niche walled up so that it was totally lost. People remembered there was an image, but they didn't know where it was. And this is how it stayed for about 450 years. And then in the year 544, the Persian army laid siege to Edessa, and during the siege, the bishop at that time of Edessa received a vision from an angel who told him to go get the image and told him where to go in the wall to go find it. And so he opened up that part of the wall, and there it was. There was the image. And so he carried it around the city to bring protection to the city. And he got to a certain part that had a bunch of copper pots, and they all started rattling. And this is how the people of Edessa discovered that the Persian army was digging a tunnel under the ground so they could come up in the middle of the city. So the people of Edessa dug a hole down to the tunnel and poured in a bunch of oil, and they set it on fire, and they burned the Persian army, and this is how the siege began to be broken. And so the image of Edessa became very, very famous at this point. Okay, so let me pause. There are a couple of different versions of how we get here. One is exactly just what I told you. Another one says that the messenger from King Abgar was an artist, and so he paints Jesus' picture, and that's what gets taken to Abgar. There's another version of the story where Jesus takes a cloth and he wipes his face with it, and it imprints his face on it, and that's what gets taken to Edessa. So there's a few different strands. It's not always the burial cloth, but there's always an image. It always goes to Abgar, who is always the king of Edessa. Okay, there are no competing traditions. It's always image, Abgar, Edessa, and a lot of times you get burial shroud in there as what is holding the image. So there are a couple of scholars who think there is a possibility it may have gone through Antioch on the way to Edessa, but it always ends up in Edessa. There's also an alternate tradition that in the year 525, I believe, there was a flood that damaged the wall in Edessa, and this is how the image got recovered. But still, it was during the siege that they walked the image around, and how they discover, with the copper pots and everything, that the Persian army was digging a tunnel. So this is this persistent and sole legend associated with this. So it becomes known as the image of Edessa or the Mandylion. Sometimes you see, well, a lot of times you see recreations in art history of the Mandylion is like this pillowcase that has the picture of Jesus' head on it, and that's it. But that would be all that you would see when it was folded up and put in a box. Okay? So it stayed in Edessa for another 400 years, and then in 944, the Emperor Romanus took it to Constantinople because this is the center of the church. This is where all the relics were collected. And so once the Byzantines had control of Edessa again, it got taken to Constantinople, and the letter of Jesus goes there as well. And this is they would put it in different palaces and different churches, and so people would go visit all the relics in Constantinople whenever they were there. And that's what was going on in 1203 when a crusader during the Fourth Crusades named Robert de Clary went to Constantinople, and he kept a travelogue of all the relics that he saw. And he writes that he came to this church, and he says, "There was another of the churches which they called My Lady St. Mary of Blasharne, where was kept the sindon or shroud in which our Lord had been wrapped, which stood up straight every Friday so that the features of our Lord could be plainly seen there. And no one, either Greek or French, ever knew what became of the sindon after the city was taken." So one of the interesting things that the STURP team found is that the shroud has been folded so that it fits around a mechanism that allows it to be raised and lowered, possibly out of a chest, which is maybe what Robert de Clary saw. A few months later, in April of 1204, the city of Constantinople was sacked by the Western Church. So during the Fourth Crusade, you had the Western Church supposed to go all the way around to Jerusalem to fight the Muslims, but instead they get to Constantinople and they attack the Eastern Church. And so the Western Church ends up killing a lot of the Eastern Christians. They stole a bunch of relics and gold, and a lot of other things got destroyed. This is where the letter from Jesus is said to have been destroyed. But I will tell you, I think the letter of Jesus is apocryphal. I don't think it ever existed. I think if Jesus ever wrote anything, we would absolutely have a copy of it. And if he ever only wrote one thing, I doubt it was a note saying, sorry, I can't come right now. That'd be odd. So, but at this point, it just disappears. There's like 150 years of almost nothing about the shroud until it appears in France in the year 1355, and it's shown by a knight named Geoffrey de Charny. Now, he doesn't explain where it was or how he got it or anything. He just shows it. And so Shroud scholars have tried to fill in this 150-year gap. And there's actually one really compelling story. It's not a ton of evidence, but it's the best we've got. And then there's an alternate theory that actually might work together with it in some way. So here's the best we got. In 1205, just a year after the sack of Constantinople, the king of Thessaly, which is the region just above above Athens, so you have the kingdom of Athens and you have a kingdom of Thessaly. The king of Thessaly wrote this to Pope Innocent III. He said, in April of last year, a crusading army, having falsely set out to liberate the Holy Land, instead laid waste to the city of Constantine during the sack. Troops of Venice and France looted even the holy sanctuaries. The Venetians partitioned the treasures of gold, silver, and ivory, while the French did the same with the relics and saints and the most sacred of all, the linen in which our Lord Jesus Christ was wrapped after his death and before the resurrection. We know that the sacred objects were preserved by their predators in Venice, in France, and in other places, the sacred linen in Athens. So according to this letter, the shroud is in Athens after the sack of Constantinople. So what makes this interesting is that the king of Athens was from Byzantine France, and his name was Othon de la Roche, and he was a crusader knight in the Fourth Crusades. He was at the sack of Constantinople, and it was his job to defend the palace of Blecharnay, which included the church of Blecharnay, where Robert de Clary said he found the shroud. Not only that, but his great-great-granddaughter is who married Geoffrey de Charny, the knight who shows the shroud. Now, the reason why, one possible reason why there's silence this whole period is because in the year 1215, Pope Innocent III made it illegal to display or sell relics without the church's permission. So if they wanted to hold on to this thing, they weren't going to tell anybody about it, which makes sense. Also in Byzantine France, at the De La Roche family castle, to this day, they have a chest that is said to have contained the Shroud of Jesus. And when it was displayed in 1355, there was a commemorative medallion struck. They had swag back in 1355, and this was found in the Seine under a bridge in Paris in 1855. But you can see the shroud is on it right here, and then this crest is the de Charny crest, and this crest is the de Vergy crest, and they were only married in 6 years, so between 1349 and 1356. This is time period where we can definitively place the shroud in Europe for sure. So that's a pretty good connection. The alternate connection has to do with the Knights Templar, who were an order of warrior monks who were supposed to protect pilgrims to the Holy Land. And if you've ever been to the Temple Mount, then the Al-Aqsa Mosque, right when you get on the mount, that was their headquarters. And they became very, very powerful and very, very wealthy. So powerful and wealthy that both the King of France and the Pope wanted them gone and wanted their money. So they outlawed them in 1314 on Friday the 13th, which is why we consider that bad luck. And they executed their leader, Jacques de Molay, in the middle of the Seine on an island in Paris. And when he was executed along with his right-hand man, the preceptor of the Templars, whose name was Geoffrey de Charnay. Now, it's not the same Geoffrey de Charnay, but because it's 40 years before the Shroud shows up, but it could be some kind of relative. The knights took vows of chastity, so if he was true to his vow, it wouldn't be a son or a grandson, so it might be a cousin or something like that. They don't spell their names exactly the same. One is Y and one is AY, but they don't have standardized spelling back then, so you can't really lean on that too hard. But another piece of compelling evidence is that when the Templars were outlawed, they confessed to having these secret ceremonies where they worshiped the image of a bearded head. And nobody knew what that meant until 1951. And this is where a Templar-era building in Templecombe, England, was shaken during a storm that came through, and part of the ceiling fell down, and on the back side of the roof was a panel with the image of a bearded head. Looks just like that, which is pretty close to the face on the shroud. So there are people who think that the Templars had custody of the shroud, but just because they had an image that's very similar to the face on the shroud doesn't prove custody. And they're a pretty good candidate for having custody, but the evidence goes with De La Roche for sure. So about 100 years after the shroud shows up in Europe, the de Charny family falls on hard times. So in 1543, they sell it to the Duke of Savoy. Savoy was an autonomous kingdom in the southeast part of France and northwest part of Italy, and their capital was Chambéry. So this is Chambéry, France, and this is the cathedral where the shroud was kept. And this is the cathedral that caught on fire in 1532, which is where the patches were done, and the backing cloth, and where the invisible reweave would have been done, if that turns out to be a real thing. So in 1578, the King of Savoy decides to move the capital to the other side of the Alps to be closer to the Archbishop, so he moves it to Turin, and that's how the shroud gets here into the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, and this is where it has been ever since, with the exception of World War II, when it was kept in a monastery just outside of Naples. So if you walk in the door there and you go all the way up to the altar and then you hang a hard left, you're looking at a side chapel, and that contains the shroud. It is a very high-tech reliquary that is not exposed so that you can see the shroud except very rarely. And when it is exposed, this is what the reliquary looks like. So it controls how much light gets in and also the environment that it's in, things like that. Okay, so we end up with the itinerary of the shroud looking like that according to the historical documents. So the question is, do we have any scientific evidence that backs up this itinerary? And it turns out we do, and it's in the form of pollen. So the idea here is that between the 40s and the 80s, there was a Swiss criminologist named Max Frey who came up with this idea. It sounds like it's straight out of Sherlock Holmes, which is to place criminals at crime scenes by taking cellophane tape and pressing it into their clothes and trying to pull off pollen that he could match at the crime scene. So in 1973, they invited him to come down and do this to the shroud. And then in 1978, remember I told you that the first 12 hours went to the Italian scientific team. Well, they asked Max Frey to be a part of that, and so he was actually the first guy to go. And the story is that on the way to the cathedral in Turin, he stopped by the drugstore and bought some tape. And that's him with the tape. So you can tell he's super happy to be there. And he did 38 different samples on the shroud. And so, I mean, think about what is going to happen when you put tape like that on material. It's going to leave this sticky residue. And not only that, but look at the tension that's on the cloth. It's already threadbare. The STURP team was totally freaking out because there was so much damage being done, because they had the 3M Corporation create a special tape just for the Shroud of Turin that allowed them to take samples without leaving any residue, and they had this special applicator that wouldn't put any tension on the cloth. But the STURP team found no pollen on the shroud, and Max Fry found 58 different kinds of pollen. So this is what the pollen looks like, stuck in the shroud, and pollen up close looks like that. So the different species of plants that are represented, they're pretty identifiable. So if you had known samples from plants and you had the patience to weed through what you were looking at in a comparison microscope, then you can identify the pollen you were looking at. And he was able to identify 56 different kinds of pollen. And the pollen comes from northern Italy, southern France, Turkey, the area around Constantinople, and the area around Jerusalem. In fact, there are 45 kinds of the 56 pollens are from the area around Jerusalem. Some of them are in bloom, which only happens in the springtime. How about that? So you can't fake that. Okay, so I'll shift gears. I'll get out of the science mode, and we'll talk about the iconographic theory for the shroud here. It's a totally different line of evidence, and it has to do with how Jesus is depicted in art, particularly Byzantine icons, because in about the middle of the 6th century, it becomes strangely instantly standardized, whereas prior to that, there's this great variety. So here are a bunch of images of Jesus going from the very earliest one in the top left corner all the way to the early 6th century. Now, the one in the top left corner doesn't count really because it's graffiti making fun of a Christian, and so Jesus is given a horse head, but that is the oldest image. And then everything else comes from ancient house churches and catacombs and things like that. But if you look at them, these ancient images of Jesus, they have all sorts of variety. He's a young man, he's middle-aged, he's short-haired, he's long-haired, he's clean-shaven, he's bearded, he's a wonder worker, he's enthroned, he's a shepherd. So there's so much variety that Augustine actually complains in one of his writings about the variety of ways that Jesus gets depicted. And then suddenly, in the middle of the 6th century, Jesus kind of looks like Barry Gibb. It's like totally standardized. But it's not just superficial. There's the person who recognized this actually kind of counted it up. And he saw that they all have the same features, that all these common things like a well, let me back this up for a second. So you've got like a V shape between the eyes. You've got, most of the time, a cleft beard. There's a space between the lower lip and the beard. There is these big, heavy, owlish eyes. You've got the shape and the size of the nose, the part in the hair, the strands of hair coming down from it. So there are a bunch of different things. There's actually 15 different things that are common on almost every single medieval icon or Byzantine icon after the middle of the 6th century. And so the question is, what happened in the middle of the 6th century that would cause that? And remember, the image of Edessa gets recovered in the year of 544. And the image of Edessa has all of those same features on it, interestingly enough. So this became a deep dive for people interested in art history. And so there was one guy in particular who made some major progress using this image. This is the oldest Christ Pantocrator icon, Pantocrator meaning ruler of all. And this is an important icon because it is from the year 550. That's around when it was created, so about 6 years after the recovery of the image of Edessa. And so in the late 70s, early 80s, before the Mac was around, this guy had 2 slide projectors, and he would project the images directly on top of each other. He had a polarizing filter going horizontal on one slide and a polarizing filter going vertical on the other, and then he had a third polarizing filter, and he would use it and turn it in order to isolate areas where these 2 images agreed exactly, and he found 170 points of congruence between these 2 images. Now, if you look at them side by side, it kind of looks like you're overstating the case. Like, there's a long-haired guy, and there's some similarities, but how exactly, do they actually match up? So we're going to do some overlays here. So if you, what I want you to do is stare at the tip of the nose when I do this overlay. So I've just got a couple Photoshop filters that allow us to see both images on top of each other at the same time. You'll see that the eyebrows fit right, they just fill right in. The beard and the mustache fill right in. The nose is the exact size and shape of what you see on the icon. The eyes will just open up. The hair hits exactly the same. And these weird marks down here turn into the top of the tunic. So, all right, here we go. Look at the tip of the nose. Ready? Here it is. See that? Hits exactly perfectly. Here's another version. Look at the tip of the nose. Everything fits exactly right. I mean, that looks like just one image that's been kind of distressed over time. One more version. This one with the positive image of the shroud looks like the flesh just fills right in. In the last 2 years or so, there have been a lot of AI images that have been created trying to flesh out the face of the man in the shroud. And they use a program that I actually work in, and I've never been, the images are beautiful, but I never thought they were super compelling in terms of what the man on the shroud would actually look like. So one of the things you have to do in that program is provide a photo reference other than the man in the shroud. So whatever other photo reference is used doesn't look like the man in the shroud. That's why it's not compelling. So what I did is I did the same thing, but I combined these 2 images because this is the closest image we have to the man in the shroud. So this is the result when you combine these 2 images together, for whatever that's worth. Okay. The guy did the same thing with, okay, we're not moving on. I have changed slides. There we go. Okay. So the guy took the oldest image of Jesus minted on a coin. So this is from the year 695. It's called a solidus. And when you do the overlay here, he found 140 different points of congruence. And this is a tiny little coin. So if you mix them together, you can see, once again, even at that tiny size, it fits really exactly. Pretty incredible. All right, I'll give you one more piece of art history evidence. And this is from a book called the Hungarian Prey Manuscript, which is dated from the year 1195. So this is 65 years older than the earliest radiocarbon date. And in this panel, this top panel, you can see that the body is in the same position as the man in the shroud, which is kind of interesting. And let me flip this around, and then look at the weave here. This weave here actually matches the pattern of weave on the shroud, and this is a very unusual pattern of weave. It's called a 3/1 herringbone weave, and it is only for kind of luxurious fabrics. The shroud's linen is a really nice piece of linen. The other interesting thing is look at the detail it includes of these 4 holes. Well, remember the sensor burns I told you about? There they are, right there, which is a really weird detail to include if the shroud didn't exist at that time, because we're talking about 65 years older than the radiocarbon date. Also, one other thing that's interesting is this thing. There's some other cloth laying there. And so that's what I'm going to tell you about now. And that is the other relic that I mentioned when I started. Remember I said there are only two relics in all of the Christian tradition that transcend being a relic and become objects of scientific inquiry. And the other one is called the Sudarium of Oviedo. And that's what this other cloth is over here that I brought with me. A Sudarium is a sweat cloth. And, we're talking about the first century Roman world. A lot of it's really hot and really dirty. And so, it's just a cloth you use to wipe the sweat off. And Oviedo is a city in Spain. It's in the mountains of Asturias, in the very northern part of Spain, about 10 or 15 miles inland. And it's a city of about 200,000 people. And the cathedral there believes that they have a cloth, this cloth, that was wrapped around Jesus' head when he died on the cross, which sounds like a really weird thing to try to envision. But remember, the whole idea with the Jews is to collect the blood to bury with the body. So the crucifixion victim is going to be spewing blood out of their nose and out of their mouth, and it's all that the pulmonary edema mixed with blood is collecting in the lungs. So what do you think is going to happen when they lift this body off the cross? It's just going to come gushing out. So they need to collect it all. So they believe this cloth is put on his head when he apparently is dead. And this is actually something that gets mentioned in Scripture. In John 20, verses 5 through 7, it says, John bent down and saw the strips of linen cloth lying there, but he did not go in. Okay, pause. Strips of linen cloth doesn't mean that Jesus was buried like a mummy. The Jews didn't practice mummification or any kind of burying with strips of cloth like that. The strips of cloth is the Greek word athonia, which means linen cloths. It's plural. But what that refers to is the burial shroud itself, called a sindon, and then the wrists would have been tied together, and probably the feet, and maybe a strip of linen cloth holding the jaw shut, like Marley's Ghost in A Christmas Carol. And then there'd be one that kind of cinches it around the waist, like a belt, to hold the burial cloth on. So in Matthew and Mark, the word gets used, it's just sindon. All they mention is the burial shroud itself. And then Luke uses both words, both sindon and athonia. So what we're talking about here are just all the cloths that are lying there. Then Simon Peter, who had been following him, arrived and went right into the tomb, and he saw the strips of linen cloth lying there and the face cloth, the sudarion, which had been around Jesus' head, not lying there with the strips of linen cloth that rolled up in a place by itself. Okay? And so this is what it looks like up close. And it does not have an image of a face on it. So if the fall-through radiation hypothesis is correct, then this was not on the body when the image got imprinted on the sheet. But it's just this big dirty cloth, and it looks like it has a bunch of blood stains on it. And there are really kind of three areas of stains. You've got this main area right here, you've got this area to the side, and you've got an area here that looks like it reflects the middle area. So what looks like is blood here has been proven to be human blood, and it is type AB, which is the same as on the shroud, which is the rarest blood type and 3 times more common in Middle Eastern Jews than in Europeans. It's also post-mortem blood. It is also 6 parts pulmonary edema to 1 part blood, just like the side wound on the man in the shroud. So it matches exactly. This is believed to be what was in direct contact with the face. And this area right here is the tip of the nose, and so you see this concentrated area of blood around the mouth and the nose right here. And then this would be this kind of hook shape, and this area right here go around the beard, and then this stem kind of goes up the bridge of the nose. I'll explain that in a minute. And this rectangle shape pools on the forehead. That's the idea. So it would have looked roughly like this. The way it registers, which means that back here it would have been anchored by pins onto the long hair of the man. If he had a ponytail, they would have used the ponytail. If he didn't have a ponytail, they gathered it together and made an ad hoc ponytail, which then gets this blood clot right here, which freezes it into a ponytail, which is why the man in the shroud still has the ponytail. And then the scientists have been able to figure out that the body when it was on the cross, the head was rocked forward and to the side like this. So as they pin the Sudarium to the back of the head, it gets wrapped around the front, makes contact, and then they don't move it through the arm here. They just leave the head there and they double it back, and that's what makes this mirrored stain. So the head is in that position, and it gets folded back like that. So so that's how this happens. And then over here, this butterfly shape, that's the blood stain that gets trapped in the long hair. And then you can see a bunch of superficial wounds right here that look very similar to the back of the head on the man in the shroud, which again look like these. The source of these blood stains are superficial wounds from what you would expect to find made by a crown of thorns, and it's lifeblood. Okay? And you can see little pinholes of where it was held to the hair. So scientists were able to figure out the body has to be in 3 different positions to make this shape. So the first one is like this, rocked forward and to the side for about 45 minutes to an hour. And then the second position is face down on the ground with the feet slightly elevated, which makes the blood run down the nose and pool on the forehead. And it's in that position for 45 minutes to an hour, which would give Joseph of Arimathea time to go get permission to bury the body, so that when he gets it, the body's flipped face up for about 5 minutes, and there are actually finger marks where somebody reaches over the head and pinches it over the nose of the man wearing the Sudarium. And then the distance between Golgotha and the tomb is less than 200 feet in the Holy Sepulchre. So that's more than enough time to get the body to there. So that's the 3 positions that make that stain. So the question is, where has this thing been? So they call in Max Fry, and he comes down in 1978 with his tape, and he finds that there are 16, he identifies 16 different kinds of pollen in 1979. Since then, there have been another 25 different kinds of pollen that have been found, and it turns out the pollen is from northern Spain, central Spain, the area around Toledo, the area around North Africa, around where Alexandria is, and the area around Jerusalem. Goes a totally different direction. But it starts in the same place. So the question now is there any documentary evidence? And the answer is there is, but it is not nearly as much as we have for the Shroud, partly because nobody knows what to call this thing, essentially. So in the early 11th century, the Bishop of Oviedo, whose name is Powell, did the research and wrote the history, compiled all the different sources. And so I'll just kind of tell you the general arc. The oldest source we have comes from 570 from a pilgrim to the Holy Land named Antonius Martyr. And he wrote that on the very bank of Jordan is a cave in which there are 7 cells and 7 maidens. In this place there is said to be the napkin that was about the head of Jesus. Now, according to Powell, what he's talking about is that the disciples of the apostles built a wooden chest and they put a bunch of relics in it, including the Sudarium, and that's what was in the caves. And then in the year 614, the Persian army came to lay siege to Jerusalem, and I'm waiting for the slide to change. Come on. Here, last time I shook it and it worked. No dice. Okay, come on. Should I reconnect? Should I try to reconnect? All right, I'm going to try to reconnect. I worked really hard on this map. All right. There we go. Okay, so 614, the Persian army lays siege to Jerusalem, so it gets moved to North Africa, probably the area around Alexandria, and then the Persian army moves into North Africa 2 years later. So in 616, it gets moved to Cartagena, Spain, which would be appearing on the screen if it was keeping up with everything. And then it popped out entirely. Okay, here we go. Let's get back into it now. All right, there we go. Alexandria. All right, 616, it gets moved to Cartagena, Spain. If we don't go there, come on, catch up. And 616, once it gets there, it gets immediately moved to Seville, or where the bishop takes it. He has it for 20 years, and when he dies, it gets moved to Toledo in 636. And then in 711, when the Muslims invade the Iberian Peninsula and start to conquer Spain, it gets moved to the northernmost area of Spain, to the mountains of Asturias. And that is where it is kept until the king of Asturias defeats the Muslims in 761, and he attributes his success and safety to the relics in the chest, and so he founds the town of Oviedo, and then he builds a cathedral. And the cathedral, let's see if this one will come up okay. All right, the cathedral looks really super cool. No, we don't want any of that. It keeps going back here. I'm so sorry. All right, we're going to make it past the map. It's important. We make it past the map. I'm so sorry about this. Okay, we're at the top of Spain. We're almost there. Almost there. One more. There it is. Okay. Yay! Okay, that's what we want. Okay, so that's the cathedral. But that is not what he built. What he built actually looks like this, which is called the Camera Santa. And the Camera Santa, it's the sacred chamber. And inside the sacred chamber is where the relics are kept. Okay, I am so sorry. I do not know why this is freaking out like this. We've never had this issue before. So it keeps wanting to show the wrong thing. Camera Santa, stay there. Okay? All right. Next thing. Okay, so that's what it looks like. There's a bunch of relics in there. And when you stick your camera through the bars, it looks like this. Come on, show me this. We're almost done. We can't have this kind of technology snafu slow us down. There it is. So that's the chest. When it was opened up in the early 11th century, it was inventoried, and then the king had it covered in this silver plating. And then the Sudarium itself is the only thing that was taken out of the chest. It was put in its own reliquary, and the facsimile of it is on display, and that is what you see there. So it's covering the window of the actual reliquary, which looks like that. Okay? So the reason why I'm showing you all of this is because if there's any correspondence between the Sudarium and the Shroud itself, if you can show this, this is really important because the Sudarium has been in Oviedo since it was founded in 761, and so that's 600 years earlier than the earliest radiocarbon date, and another incredibly compelling reason for believing the Shroud is older than the carbon date indicates. So what I've done here is I've made an outline of the major stains on the Sudarium. So you can see you've got the nose right here. This is what we're going to register with. And then you have the main bloom of the stain here outlined in blue. And you've got the upper lip, the lower lip. In green, you have the main, bigger part of the stain. So this is around the beard and then going up here and into the forehead area. Now, there's a blood drop right here that is probably also the same as this blood drop right here. Remember, the man in the Sudarium this is wrapped around his head and then rewrapped, and then he's in 3 different positions. So there's going to be this shifting in registration, which is probably means that this blood drop, these 2 blood drops, are from the same wound. And it's also going to mean that it's never going to match the face on the shroud dead exact. But you'll see there's a lot of correspondence. You've got a big stain over here that when you look over here, you've got a cluster of stains on the shroud. So this stain over here on the Sudarium, you can see it right here on the shroud. And you can also see that this hole on the Sudarium matches almost exactly the size and position of this blood stain right here. So there's a theory that this was cut out and given to somebody important at some point. The edge of the forehead stain goes right along this epsilon-shaped blood rivulet right here, and you can see everything just kind of maps into place perfectly. So if you color in just this big general area and then map it onto the face, that's it to scale. It matches perfectly. It's like a mask of blood, and that is exactly what it would have been. If you put that onto a sculpture that's based on the shroud, it would look like that. Okay, so that's what the stain on the Sudarium is containing exactly onto this face. It's pretty incredible. So on the back side, you've got the butterfly stain. That would match remember this dark funnel shape, that's the long hair. So this would map right onto the long hair. And then the superficial stains back here that look like they're from the crown of thorns match very closely to the back of the shroud. So it maps like that. Almost exactly. That's pretty good. Okay, so I'll finish with this, and then we can do questions if anybody wants to stick around for that. But I don't want to overstate the case on the Sudarium and the shroud. If these things are not authentic, it doesn't mean that Christianity isn't true. Okay, the truthfulness of Christianity does not depend on the authenticity of relics. So if these things either are forgeries or they turn out to be misidentified or something like that, it doesn't say anything about the truthfulness of Christianity. But if they do end up being proven to be authentic, then they are archaeological confirmation of what you read about in the Gospels, and they give us additional background information. But more importantly than that, think about this. As Christians, we believe that Jesus shed his blood for the forgiveness of our sins. And this is so important to us. We think about it so much, we end up kind of losing the historicity of it and the concreteness of it, and it becomes spiritualized and kind of abstract. But if these things are authentic and Jesus shed his blood for the forgiveness of our sins, then that's the blood. That's the blood that was shed for the forgiveness of our sins. It's the blood of the covenant shed for the forgiveness of many. So, thank you for sticking around.
Thank you, Doug, so very much. Couple of things. If you need to go get your kids, feel free to be dismissed right now. If you'd like to stick around and you're able for a little time of Q&A, you can do that, and Doug will take questions because I'm sure several of you have them. But if you need to go in his peace. Let me pray. Father, thank you for the time to be together tonight, for feeding us in more ways than one. Thank you for our elder, Doug Powell, Lord, for the passion he has for the confirmation of the Gospels, Lord. But moreover, as he said, the Christian faith does not rely on these things, but the power of your word and your spirit working by and through it. And so we're thankful for that. Lord, I thank you for all our folks here tonight, and I pray that you would prepare our hearts for the rest of Holy Week, where we contemplate the death and resurrection of Jesus our Lord, in whose name we pray. Amen. So if you're able to stay and like to do some Q&A, Doug will be happy to do that. Want to let you know there are books on the front table down here that Doug has written. And there are only 2 copies of Resurrection Eyewitness, which is an apologetic for the resurrection of Christ. And I am going to give one of these books away right now. In fact, what I want to know is, does anyone in here, let me see here, who in here has a birthday that is today? Let me ask this. Who drove the furthest to get here? Did anybody drive over 50 miles to get here? You drove over 50 miles to get here. Did anybody? Oh, we got 2 people drove over. How many miles you drive? 150. 250. All right, here's what we're going to do. I told you there were 2 of these left. So you're both going to get one. All right, you're both going to get one. So, yeah. Sir, if you will just come see, in fact, I'm going to bring one over to you, okay? But here's what I want the rest of you to do. I don't want there to be a single book left on this table. In fact, I want to put a plug in for this series here. This is the Graham Elliott series, which is sort of like Doug Powell. It's kind of like autobiographical. This is a story in several volumes here. 4 now, right? And how many are going to be all together, Doug? They're going to be 4. So he's finished with this series, and is a story of an archaeologist studying, exploring biblical archaeology. I tell you, you would love to have this set, and they're all over here. I think all volume, maybe the first volume's not there. Anyway, here's the thing. I don't want a single book left on this table. Let's buy every book on these tables over here, and that way Doug can take Jennifer out on a date a little bit later. How's that? Okay. Here's what we're going to do. Learic and I are going to walk around. If you have a question you'd like to ask Doug, okay, we're going to begin over here. Can you demonstrate again what they are to do? They are to raise their hand enthusiastically like you did, right? All right.
Hi, thank you, Doug. We have better testing these days. Why we haven't been able to do DNA testing, genetic testing?
The best they've done on DNA, that it doesn't contain any nuclear DNA, so you can't do the kind of thing that we imagine you can do with DNA. I'll tell you, there are 2 problems. There's not enough of the DNA to do it, of the nuclear DNA, because it's degraded. But second of all, it doesn't mean a thing unless you have an exemplar to compare it to. We don't have any DNA from Jesus in the first place. And the problem is that so many people have handled this for so long, there's tons of DNA on it, so you don't even know whose DNA it's from.
Correct, but we can get it from the Oviedo cloth.
Oh, from the Sudarium. Yeah, you probably could if you could get permission.
Other questions?
There's one in the back, David.
Here we go.
In John 19, there's a reference to Nicodemus bringing 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes, and I guess I'm wondering, I might have missed it. I know there's like traces of pollen and everything on the shroud, but I've heard there's some debate about, why is there no trace of spices?
STURP found no spices. There's no evidence of spice on it. Doesn't mean there wasn't any. There's just none left if there was. So that's all we know.
I see you right here, sir.
Here you go, Craig. You're going to get a mic.
Hello. How dark or how much has it faded? Do we know? Was it darker?
It was darker. It has faded significantly recently, especially since the first photograph. A couple of things have happened. Number one, they just didn't realize how much light was going to damage it when it got exposed. So there was even one time, I think it was in the early 70s, they decided to do the very first televised exhibition. So they brought in all these big bright TV lights on it, right? And it faded it significantly, and measurably anyway. And then in 2002, when they put a brand new backing cloth on it, the brand new backing cloth is it's white, it's super clean. And they found that when they put it back on the cloth, it's not nearly as visible. So it's fading. And this is why about 3 weeks ago, there was an announcement about whether it was going to be on display, because this is a Jubilee year. So this was going to be a year where it was on display, and they decided not to do it. The last time it was on display, which I think in 2015, there was damage to both the visibility of the image, and also it's always been displayed, so it's been displayed like this. It's stored flat, but then it gets displayed like that. And when it was displayed like that, it hurt the cloth. Just the tension on it hurt it. So if they ever do display it again, and it is an if, then it's going to be like a table, and you'll just walk up like a viewing. So.
I was being asked just a second ago, are you allowed to go ahead during Q&A and get books? And of course the answer to that is yes.
Sure.
And if you slip me maybe a 5 spot, I'll see if I can get it autographed for you, okay? And I'll go ahead and get your books.
Okay, my question is, the image shows a beard, correct? So in Isaiah 50, it talks about part of the torturing was the plucking of his beard. Mm-hmm. That's my question.
So I don't know if you heard it. The question was about the beard. The man in the shroud has a beard, and the question is, in Isaiah it says that the beard would be plucked out. Well, it doesn't mean it would be plucked so that he's completely like clean shaven. So some people believe that what you see, let's see if we can get back to just the face of the man on the shroud right here. Okay, you can see a cleft area right here. This may be explained by part of the beard being pulled out. You don't have to pull all of it out. Okay, it's just, some people believe that the beard was pretty long. Okay, so if they're just grabbing at it and yanking at it, this might be an indication of where it was missing. It also might just be a dimple that was created by the headband that's holding the chin shut. We don't know. But one of the explanations for that corresponds with what you're talking about is that. So it doesn't mean it all has to be plucked out. Yes?
Could you put the AI picture back up? Yes.
Oh man, I'll just send it to you. You don't have to take that picture.
What has most surprised you as you've gone through this period of discovery?
What kind of what?
What has most surprised you in this?
What has most surprised me? What has most surprised me is, well, I guess I don't have a ready answer. So off the top of my head, I'll say the astonishing amount of evidence. I mean, it is super, super hard to keep up with everything that's being done on the Shroud, all the new things that are coming out. On the other hand, it's super hard to tell which things are credible and which things aren't, because so many people abuse the Shroud and overstate the case for the Shroud, or say they see things on the Shroud that aren't credible or aren't there, that, you know, to kind of vet it is a difficult thing. So when I do this presentation, what you just heard me do, I purposely, intentionally, I never said it was Jesus. It's the man in the shroud. And I think if I make the modest case and I understate everything, You saw how compelling it was already. I don't have to overstate it. It's so exciting you want to overstate it, okay? But to discipline myself to stay with only the most credible evidence is something I strive to do. But what makes it hard is there's tons of credible evidence, and there's also just tons and tons of bad evidence or overstated cases. So, when the wax S dating came out, everybody's like, oh, it dates to the 1st century, and that's not what it does. Okay, it indicates that, but there's serious problems with that you don't hear about, because it's not really sexy, to read about that in the news. So, when you dig deeper, not everything is what you think it is. Danny?
Yeah, I'm just curious, how many other relics of that rough time period do we have and do we study? And how would you compare the authenticity or the amount of things that can back up or document or compared to things that are not the Shroud, for example?
There are thousands of relics, thousands. Famously, there's more pieces of the cross than could ever comprise the cross, right, that you could see. But the thing is with relics, as Protestants who don't have a place in our tradition for relics, we don't kind of really understand what's going on in Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism, because especially in Eastern Orthodoxy, the point to ask if these things are authentic or not is the wrong question. They think this is a rationalistic question. So the question is, when you look at any relic, especially in Orthodoxy, in any relic, the point is this commemorating a real person or a real event? Okay, that's the important thing. So the authenticity thing is like some kind of scientific question. But the real important question is not whether, like last summer, one of the relics I saw was the skull of the woman at the well. And so, I'm with an Orthodox priest, and I'm like, how do they know it's the skull of the woman at the well? And he goes, it's the wrong question. Do you believe that there was a woman at the well? The answer is yes. And he goes, well, this is what we revere, when what we venerate. And so that's the important thing, is that tradition says, and this is the oldest one that says it's the skull of the woman at the well. That's what you're honoring. And but then they'll say, but it's the authentic thing. But it doesn't matter if it is, but it is. Okay? And so they just kind of shift like that. So we want kind of this scientific approach to it, and they don't have that at all, because we don't think of tradition in the same way. The important thing is the tradition, because it ties back to a real historical event that we all believe in. But their importance is resting on tradition, and ours is authenticity, and they're kind of just like, well, who cares? Okay. So, like, I was at one monastery where I wanted to see, they had the oldest Byzantine manuscripts, the oldest Byzantine copies of the Bible in existence, and I wanted to see them. And they were like, why do you want to see them? And I'm like, because they're the oldest ones. And they said, but you already know what it says, right? And so they honor the newer ones, and everything else is just paper and ink. Why would you want to look at that? Totally different mindset.
And of course, if I may be so bold as to add to that, you realize, Doug mentioned as Protestants, one of the things that of course arose in the time of the Reformation was the worship and the veneration of relics. And it became a huge tourist industry. It's one of the things that prompted Luther and Calvin to do what they did, because what ends up happening is, with the emphasis on the veneration of the relics, the emphasis taken off of the centrality of the word. And so we're looking at a couple of different approaches to the way we view these things. And if any of you want to talk more about that, come see me later. But we can't be in a Presbyterian church without mentioning that there is a reformational reality or a reformational connection to the issue of relics.
Yes, sir.
I may have missed it, having a senior moment, but did you say that if the shroud is indeed what we think it is, it's authentic, that you kept saying we don't really know what caused the image?
Hey, Mark, would
Yes.
you hold the microphone up higher, no, higher with your hand because you're blocking the transmission by holding
blocking
it
it.
down at the bottom.
Okay, good deal. So, in case I missed it, but isn't the idea that's postulated that if it's legitimate, that what caused the image was some burst of energy that happened at the time that Christ came back to life? Is that
So the hypothesis is a burst of energy from the body. So it doesn't say when the body came back to life, right? Because that's not part of what the scientific claim is. Obviously, that's clearly what we're talking about, and that's what that scientist believes. And one of the fascinating, so yes, that is what that would be. So the event of the resurrection is, if you want to put it into faith terms, then yes, that is when that happens. And the fascinating thing is, remember, if what you're looking at is a photographic negative, well, you can see the hair, right? It's a little bit dark. Well, if there's a photographic negative, what does that mean his hair is like? What color is his hair? It's white. What color is Jesus' hair in Revelation 1? How about it?
Hey, Doug, I just want to say that if you haven't read Doug's fiction books, they are fantastic, and he really does get into the relics and everything. And if you find this interesting, Pastor Jeremiah J. Johnston used your photograph in an interview that he did with Glenn Beck on his podcast, and it's on YouTube if you want to watch it. He gets into this even more, or not, I wouldn't say more, but differently. So it's really,
he did
he's
another
cited-
podcast with Michael Knowles that's going to drop on Friday, and I make a little cameo in that and talk about the Sudarium. So.
And I want to know when you're doing a book signing again.
When I what? Oh, I don't. If I had an answer, I'd give it to you. I'll sign anything you want. So.
We got time for one or two more questions, Lee Eric, you think? One or two more?
Bye, Craig. Thank you for coming. Your hair looks just like Jesus's would have in the shroud. So, all right. See you, man. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. I was curious, biblically it talks about how that the Son of God was scourged beyond recognition. And so when we look at the face, it doesn't have, I mean, you talk about the blood, expending from the lungs out of the nares, but I didn't know, back to what that gentleman said, if it was the image at the resurrection versus the brutality done to the face.
Well, the man, and one of the things we didn't talk a whole lot about is he's brutalized. His cartilage is broken on the nose. It's slightly to the side. He's got bruising, very bad on his face, particularly on one side. His eyes are almost swollen shut. He's pretty beat up. Okay, so I'm not 100% sure where to go with your question, but we know that with the resurrection sightings that are recorded in the Gospels, that when Jesus appears, he appears healed. Okay, so this image is made during the resurrection. If that is what caused it, then we would expect him to not be. To at least have some sort of healing in there as well. So clearly not fully healed because he's still got all the bruising and stuff like that. But if he is as disfigured as you were saying he might be, he's clearly not in this. So we don't know why. Okay? So.
Maybe one more question? Hey.
He's doing a paper on the shroud.
I was just wondering, the triangles that are on the shroud, would those be like holes or had they been patched up?
Yes, and in fact, I will send your dad and your mom a picture of the shroud without the patches on it. Okay, because they got taken off in the year 2002. And so what they still look like triangular holes, except they're super jaggedy. Okay, but yeah, they're triangular holes. That's why they made the triangle patches. So, and then there was a bunch of soot and ashes that was kind of trapped in the patch under the sew. So they took everything off and they scraped it all off and they kept it. So.
Y'all appreciate Doug? Let's let him know.
Yeah. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you so much. Again, make sure and go to christpres.org/Easter. You'll find out more about the things coming up. We have Good Friday, service is Friday, and then our service is on Sunday. Lord bless and keep y'all.